Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead of Tablet, the Wall Street Journal, Hudson Institute, and the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. Researchers at the U.S. Geological Survey and the Arkansas government announced this week that they have found a trove of lithium, a critical raw material for electric vehicle batteries, in an underground brine reservoir in Arkansas. With the help of water testing and machine learning, the researchers determined that there might be 5 to 19 million tons of lithium, more than enough to meet all of the world's demand for the metal, in a geological area known as the Smackover Formation. Several companies, including ExxonMobil, are developing projects in Arkansas to produce lithium, which is dissolved in underground brine. Most of the world's lithium right now is produced in Australia and South America. A large majority of it is then processed in China, which also dominates the manufacturing of electric vehicle batteries. Walter, is this news or faux news?
I would say it's more of the same. America keeps getting lucky in ways that some people find very heartening and other people find kind of irritating. I do think that there's something here that is a little different about America, which is this business of in the U.S., if you own a piece of land, you own what's underneath it. But generally speaking, you own the mineral rights and so on. So we have a much weaker NIMBY lobby. I mean, people may think our NIMBY lobby is pretty strong. But if something like this were found in a lot of the world, there would be huge efforts to stop any kind of extraction. I suspect most of the folks in Arkansas will be really happy and just hope there's some of that lithium under their house as well. We found, people sort of keep thinking that the United States is going to run out of minerals or materials. So far, we haven't. We had about 25 years when everybody thought our days as a major oil producer were coming to an end. And world politics shifted because people thought, oh my gosh, they're going to be dependent now entirely on the Middle East forever. But now we're exporting energy again. And as we're shifting, the energy transition, whatever that's going to look like happens, it turns out we've got a lot of the stuff that you need to succeed in that too. So God keeps blessing the USA as far as I can see.
Do you see the potential for some longer-term political realignment here around natural resource extraction? I mean, historically, the GOP is the party of oil and gas and such, but if the resources being mined are for things like electric vehicle batteries or solar panels or other non-fossil fuel intensive technologies, is there a chance there to expand the Democratic coalition to accommodate natural resource extraction?
I'd say it would take a lot to make that happen in Arkansas. And, even in the face of a very close election where Pennsylvania is a swing state, you'll pardon me if I say that I don't think that all of the Harris campaign's announcements about an undying love of fracking that they've suddenly discovered, I'm not actually sure how durable that will be. So I think we've got, the problem is that a lot of folks in the Green Coalition hate green energy production as much as they hate fossil fuel energy production. They sort of just hate production, at least some of them. And those, states like Texas seem to, you'd think, oh, well, they're so in love with oil, they'll never do anything. They're leaders in solar and wind. I mean, basically, if the feds are going to subsidize it, they'll do anything. So right now, it looks to me as if a producerist coalition in this country is going to somewhat trend right just because of the kind of, elite green aversion to digging holes and building buildings and all of those kinds of things. But we'll see.
All right, our second story. Over the weekend, a Telegram channel aligned with Iran's IRGC published leaked classified U.S. intelligence documents, including a report by the Department of Defense National Geospatial Intelligence Agency about Israel's plans to attack Iran, according to Axios. The channel claimed it obtained these documents from a, quote, source in the U.S. intelligence community. White House officials reportedly shocked and appalled by the breach have launched an investigation into the leaks. A different interpretation was supplied this week by Israel's I-24 News, which cited an account of U.S.-Iranian talks published in the Kuwaiti press that Washington was directly briefing Iran on potential Israeli targets. According to that report, quote, in its communication, the U.S. also suggested that Iran consider evacuating certain military and security installations. It isn't a leak if they're briefing them directly, close quote. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, non-news in a sense that, in the middle of that, sort of fog of denials and charges and countercharges, I have absolutely no idea what happened or why. I mean, obviously, the Iranians have ended up with something. How important is it? That's very hard to say. I mean, to a certain degree, probably you or I could sit down and come up with like charts of potential Israeli targets in Iran. Oh, look, nuclear site, circle, circle, circle. Ooh, big military facility, circle, 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 circle. This doesn't necessarily strike me. This isn't like Mata Hari grade espionage here necessarily. Now, obviously, if it's if it's like step one, detonate all the pagers in the pockets of the Revolutionary Guard using code XYXYX. Okay, now that's a leak. This doesn't quite rise to that level. And it also seems that people have been more interested in making sort of political hay out of this. So an Israeli source that wants to say America isn't really supporting us enough, they're hyping the danger of the leak. There were a lot of reports that turned out not to be very accurate, identifying a particular person as being the source of the leak and then going on to make an attack on Philip Gordon, Kamala Harris's national security advisor, because of a connection between him and the person. And then it turns out, well, that actually doesn't seem to be what people think is happening. So fog of war is where I put all of this. Fog of war.
All right, final story of the week. Thousands of people have been hired at Chicago public schools over the past few years, fueled by $2.8 billion in federal COVID relief funding. Now the money is gone, but no one wants to reduce the workforce, and an ugly budget fight has plunged one of the nation's largest districts into a financial and leadership crisis. The new teachers, aides, and school nurses, officials say, were desperately needed even before the pandemic extracted a severe toll on the city's children, according to the Washington Post. But no one in the district has a plan for how to keep paying them. Other school districts around the country may soon face similar budget reckonings as the COVID relief money runs out, though most would be challenged to match Chicago's level of chaos. Walter, is this news or faux news?
Well, parts of it are clearly faux news. I mean, there's to argue that Chicago was plunged into a leadership crisis by this development. I think Chicago is in a leadership crisis. And things like this are the kinds of things that happen when you have a totally incompetent political class. I can't claim to be an expert on Chicago politics, but I do know somebody told me, who seemed to know what they were talking about. So, hey, I'm going to run with it. Is that the Chicago passed a law some years ago requiring everybody who worked for the city to live inside the city limits, which, seems like, hey, we're spending the money, taxpayers' money. Why shouldn't that money be spent in Chicago? Okay, fair enough. But then what that turns out is other people flee Chicago because of high costs, crime, what have you, bad schools, other reasons that people flee big cities. The city workers become ever more important as a voting bloc. And to everyone's shock and surprise, it turns out that they like to keep voting for pay raises for themselves. And they often don't seem all that interested with the overall situation of the city. So Chicago has been, which when I was young, people used to talk about Chicago as the city that works. Yeah, it has a machine. The machine's kind of crooked, but they get things done. They talked about honest graft, where, okay, they steal 20%, but you get the facility that you were paying for. Because Chicago seems to have moved in another direction since then, where the schools don't do a very good job of teaching. The city is not working. The pensions are honestly, if the people that run the Chicago pension system tried to pull the accounting tricks and so on that they've done, I think a lot of them, if they were in the private sector, a lot of them would be in jail. And it is, I think, morally unspeakable the way that people have been encouraged to think about that their pensions are safe in a city that is probably not going to be able to honor its obligations going forward. So this is, I think, just another long, ugly step. Are those nurses and teachers' aides and teachers urgently needed? I can't tell you. Can't say I spent a lot of time going from one Chicago elementary school to another, checking things out. I'm sure you can always find something that somebody can do. And my guess would be, when you have kids, there's a lot of things that somebody could do. And you can always say, well, let's make the class sizes smaller. Let's have another aide in there. And I'm sure there's always some added benefit to it. But the job of grown-ups in a school system is to use the resources that you actually have to deliver the best level of services that you can. I don't think there are many unbiased observers who look at the Chicago educational system and say that's what's going on.
Sport generally, I feel like I've been reading all my life that Chicago's on the precipice of a total collapse of its finances and social services and everything else. It definitely doesn't seem like anything's gotten better in that time, as you described. But how long can a city like this just sort of ingloriously muddle through?
Well, you can, as long as you keep having COVID pandemics that pump billions of dollars into your city, it's amazing what federal funding can do. And we have to assume that there's a whole class of people developing, Chicago's energy transformation. That's going to be another zippity-doo $1 billion for this and that and the other. And then what about, just endless list of things that you're going to come up with. And if you keep coming to the government, and as long as you've got a Democratic president, Democrats running the House and the Senate, you're probably going to do all right. You won't get everything you want, but you'll get chunks. I think the problem that we see is that Chicago, again, maybe you have to take a longer span of life, like my lifespan, where Chicago has gone from being the city that works and the miracle among cities that shows that things can really work to this sort of, Detroit, following Detroit on the path downhill. And I do think we're seeing a diminishing level of political competence in the city machine. So, how long can it last? I don't know. If I knew things like that, Jeremy, I wouldn't be wasting my time on a podcast with you. I'd be buying and selling municipal bonds and shorting markets and making zillions of dollars and then, buying politicians for lunch. I'd buy the Chicago Teachers Union. I wouldn't complain about it.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. You were in Berlin and elsewhere in Central Europe last week, Walter, and from there you wrote the following after President Biden was awarded the Order of Merit by the German government. Quote, "What the Scholz and Biden teams now want is an off-ramp from Vladimir Putin. A compromise peace in which Ukraine surrenders territory to Russia but gains NATO and EU membership would, they hope, be acceptable to Kiev and bring a not too humiliating end to the war. Putin, unfortunately, isn't in the business of offering easy off-ramps. Sensing Western war weariness and Ukrainian weakness, he will probably demand a high price for peace. His territorial demands will likely be large, and letting Ukraine join NATO is not on his to-do list. There are three things Putin wants from the war: as much of Ukraine's territory and population as he can conquer, Russian vetoes over the foreign and economic policy of what is left of Ukraine after the war, and a substantial weakening of both NATO and the EU. Although the costs are high, every day of the war brings Putin closer to all three objectives." Walter, what do you see as the plausible scenarios for what happens in Ukraine, and what, if anything, would be different from the current likely outcomes if either Harris or Trump wins the election, which now is less than 2 weeks away?
Well, I think unless something changes, we're on a sort of trajectory of Ukraine slowly losing territory, slowly losing sort of enthusiasm for the war, financial pain, economic pain, physical pain actually increasing because the Russians have done a pretty good job of damaging Ukraine's electric grid. So, and heating. A lot of in Ukraine, a lot of places are sort of centrally heated via steam pipes and so on. So it's easy to knock out heating for a whole area of a city. And Ukrainian winters, even with climate change, are not great places to be without heating. So, and by the way, the electrical problem also makes it harder for war production to go on. So, what's going to happen? If this continues, one likely scenario is that Ukraine's slow retreat might begin to speed up, that soldiers hearing about their families, who many of them won't have seen for a long time because some of them have been on the front almost since the beginning of the war. Their families or don't have heat, are in lots of trouble, and you begin to say to yourself, am I helping my family more by staying here on the front line, or would I help them more going home and help them get the stuff that they need? And that desertion can become a factor. I think it probably increases the ingenuity with which Ukrainians would seek to dodge the draft, all of those kinds of things, begins to create political fissures inside the Ukrainian political system. Is Zelensky really such a great leader? We're 32 months now into the war. Are we winning? What is his plan? He talked about his plan for victory. He went all over the West. Nobody seemed to be that impressed by his plan for victory, and they're not funding or supplying his plan for victory. So what does that mean? You got all of this going. And on the other side, you've got Putin throwing in North Korean troops now. Not a great sign. So, maybe that Russia is running short of men, but then it's also a demonstration they know how to get them. And Putin has been very good about using people that he isn't necessarily all that fond of as the human sacrifices for his policy. So prisoners, Chechens, North Koreans. I'm sure he would be happy to fight to the last North Korean in Ukraine. Now, it's possible, let's be clear, we don't know as much about Russia's problems as we do about Ukraine's problems, because while the Ukrainians aren't exactly broadcasting their concerns, it's relatively easy for us to have a sense of what's going on there. Putin is much more focused on keeping bad news to himself and projecting a kind of propaganda image of victory and strength. So we can't really tell whether, in fact, Russia is on the verge of cracking. Sometimes things like that happen, where a totalitarian society, which looked like it was ready to just roll along forever, begins to crumble unexpectedly. That's happened in my lifetime more than once. So so that's another scenario, is that actually Russia is the one that is closest to the point of collapse and things start to fall apart there. Trump talks about that he could bring a solution even, before he gets inaugurated. We'll see. Again, there's a long record of American presidents who say before an election, I have a plan to end the war, and the war somehow goes its own way, even when they're put into office. But I think Trump does have in mind some kind of thing like, okay, Putin, here's what I'll let you have if you'll do what I want, and here's how much I'll help Ukraine if you won't do what I want. That seems to be what we're being told he has in mind. I can't tell you what those things are, or how persuasive to Putin they're likely to be, but it will be interesting. With Harris, I think what we have to expect is more of the same. I haven't heard anything from her on the campaign trail about what she would do differently in Ukraine than what Biden has been doing. I personally think that Biden has, in a sense, picked the exact sour spot, which is we're not doing enough, evidently, to help Ukraine win, but we're engaging our prestige and making it not just a Ukraine-Russia issue. We've made it a Russia-NATO issue and a Russia-United States issue, so that losing the war would be more expensive now than it would have been, in February of 22. So what would Harris do, a Harris administration, if, say, in early February, Russia's good at winter offensives, at least historically, and there were some big winter battles fought on Ukrainian territory in the 1940s. If Russia starts driving toward Kyiv, not at 100 yards a day or 300 yards a day, but 5, 10 miles, you start getting breakthroughs, and it begins to look like the whole front could collapse. What does she do? I don't think she knows. I don't even know if she's thought about it. I'm sure some people in the Pentagon have been thinking about it, and people in the State Department have been thinking about it. But that could happen faster than we expect. And right now we're in this kind of, it's a comfortably uncomfortable position. That is, the war is bad, and nobody's happy about the war, but we can just basically argue with each other endlessly. Should we give them slightly more money, slightly less money? Should we be a little bit more aggressive in sending them more powerful arms? And should we unleash them a little bit and let them shoot a little bit more into Russia? Or shouldn't we? And we just, we can have these little political fights, and everybody writes their memos, and everybody gets on TV and talks about it, and everybody feels very statesmanlike and sober and all these wonderful things. But there's a status quo there that we're all implicitly assuming is not going to start changing quickly. Maybe it won't. Maybe this war is going to be a long stalemate. But I don't think we should exclude the possibility that we will find ourselves in a place where decisions have to be made quickly. None of the decisions are easy. None of the decisions are risk-free. None of the decisions are popular, and none of the decisions are cheap. I think that we may be closer to that than we think.
This final question is someone who's studied it and watched it for decades now. Where are you on NATO and how you think of it? I mean, you kind of have MAGA in America, and then the far left and far right in Germany seem to be, quite negative on it. And then you have the centrists like Biden and Schultz who seem to be kind of delusional about its capabilities or cohesiveness or centrality to events. How are you thinking about NATO in the next maybe 5 to 10 years?
I think we said before, maybe on this podcast, that there are a lot of people who make very nice livings working for NATO, and they intend to go on getting paid and going to work every morning or working remotely now that we can, and getting those salaries and have absolutely no plans to change anything. And we should never underestimate the enormous force of bureaucratic inertia behind any existing institution, whether it's in civilian life, whether it's national, international, military. And so NATO, has a raison d'etre no matter what. But I think we have to think about what happens. Let's say Russia wins in Ukraine, which is to say, my definition of a Russian victory would be they end up with more territory than they had in February 22, and the West is not able to bring Ukraine into NATO or the EU. That would be, I think, a very clear-cut political and military victory for Putin. Does NATO become stronger because everybody says, oh my goodness, the Russians are more of a threat than we thought, and so we have to get more serious about it? Does NATO splinter because some of its members say, wow, we're really scared? The Lithuanians, the Poles, maybe the Finns and the Swedes and some others, while others say, oh, Ukraine is a very long way away. And actually, Russia is now going to be a bigger economic influence, and we can't have an unnatural division with Russia. We need to be rethinking fundamental concepts. And then will the Americans be thinking, those Europeans, they really are good allies. They're doing their part against Russia, and we really do need to help them. Or are we going to say those lazy, useless Europeans, they're not really doing anything. We've got enough problems with China. Who cares? So we're in kind of an unknown territory politically, but bureaucratically, the territory is very known. And what you see is you have a lot of fossilized institutions in international life, OSCE, which was once going to be this kind of central force. I believe they still have a nice bureaucracy, and people are still earning salaries and even getting political appointments to ambassadorships and all kinds of lovely things. And I'm sure that, we'll probably get some angry mail. We are too doing all kinds of things that you just don't even know. And there are others like that. So will NATO become more or less relevant? It really depends on the choices that we and our leading European allies make.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. You also visited Budapest last week, Walter, land of delicious pastry and confused right-wing American pundits. So give us your favorite Budapest travel tips.
Well, first of all, do go. It is beautiful. They really understand the Danube there. And we were lucky enough to take a little boat ride up and down the river, which I hadn't done before. I've been to Budapest a number of times. So this was the first time I actually spent some time on the river and just see the city and the kind of, with a guide who knew what she was talking about. So we were learning a lot about the history and the different architectures and so on. Absolutely great. If you are a goose liver fan, you are really making a mistake in not going to Budapest. I think, I don't know if all of those dishes would be legal in the state of California. Jeremy, you might not be allowed. And I don't know if California tries to do extraterritorial jurisdiction so that if you eat goose liver outside of California, you can be fined and arrested and so on once you get home. But the food was good. Hotels are nice. We went out actually and saw this, that where they put all their statues, communist propaganda statues after the revolution there. And it really was interesting. The very, very knowledgeable guide who, or I guess she was the director of the museum or whatever, who showed us around, was able to talk about the different styles of communist propaganda, that as the politics of the different communist regimes changed, they would choose, the new political masters would favor, a different kind of subject, a different kind of framing for the propaganda, different artistic techniques. And so it's actually, a quite rich look into the evolution of communism in Hungary. So go. It's a great place. The politics didn't get into too deeply. I would say that something to think about Hungary is that this is a country that really feels wronged by history. At the end of they'd always seen themselves as sort of, unfortunately, under the Austrian boot. They kind of got out of it more or less in 1867, but they still got dragged into World War I with the Austrians. They lose the war. They lose the Hungarian half of most of the Hungarian half of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's a lot of bitterness about the millions of ethnic Magyars who now live outside the boundaries of Hungary. It's this sore that doesn't go away. It gives them a sense of cynicism about the West. They don't necessarily see, wow, the West, a desire to maintain the territorial status quo. That does not immediately strike a lot of Hungarian nationalists as a sign of moral purity. And they had kind of bad geopolitical luck. After all, in World War II, they sort of align with Hitler and pay a price for that. And then they're, through no choice of their own, they're dragged into the Cold War on the Soviet side and the losing side. So World War I losing side, World War II losing side, Cold War losing side. And now in the sort of European politics, they're very much the minority voice within the EU. So the Hungarians really do have this kind of chip on their shoulder. And for Americans trying to understand Hungarian politics, the kinds of theater that a Hungarian leader needs to produce, all countries want to be bigger than they are, more important than they are. Even our own dear United States, wants to be, as it Teddy Roosevelt said, or they said about Teddy Roosevelt that he wanted to be the child at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral. That kind of national egotism, when it isn't fed, it gets voracious. And modern Hungarian, 20th century Hungarian politics always had this theatrical air to it. They say about Admiral Horthy was the regent of Hungary. He was an admiral in a country that didn't have a navy and the regent of a country that didn't have a king. And so Orban, I think, to some degree, needs to produce a kind of historical pageant that satisfies what some Hungarians feel they should have but don't. President Macron, I can say, is not entirely exempt from this need. I know there are some folks on the right in America who see Hungary as a kind of new ideological direction and something that we should all be learning from. I'll just say I didn't spend enough time there talking to people who were involved in it to say too much either way. They're clearly, there's something in this idea that small nationalities should not just be, sort of subsumed by some huge cosmopolitan transnational empire or whatever. There is a loss of autonomy, democracy, and so on that way. Yet at the same time, is Hungary really a model for the rest of the world? I think there's some questions about that too.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.